The Panama Canal.
Table of Contents: The Panama Canal.
The story of the Panama Canal, the Americans, the United States and the Canal.
The discovery of gold in California in 1848 and the rush of would-be miners stimulated the U.S. interest in creating a canal between the oceans.
Recognizing a need for a water passage, in part for U.S. naval ships, President Ulysses S. Grant ordered surveys of Panama and Nicaragua in 1869. The results favored a canal route through Nicaragua. Theodore Roosevelt, who became President of the United States in 1901, believed that the U.S.-controlled canal across Central America was a vital strategic interest to the U.S. This idea gained wide impetus following the destruction of the battleship USS Maine in Cuba in 1898, and the Spanish-American War that followed.
The USS Oregon, a battleship stationed in San Francisco, was dispatched to take the place of the battleship USS Maine. But the voyage around Cape Horn took 67 days. Although she was in time to join in the Battle of Santiago Bay, the voyage would have taken just 3 weeks via Panama.
Theodore Roosevelt was the big stick president. Might was good, though not necessarily right. Roosevelt was especially proud of America's Navy and its naval power. The incident during the Spanish War involving the battleship Oregon's 2-month trip around South America also affected Roosevelt and the rest of America in a big way.
Ships sailing between the east and west coasts of the United States and Canada, which otherwise would have to go around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, would shorten their voyage by about 8,000 miles by using the canal.
President Roosevelt saw a canal as a prerequisite to American naval superiority, and wanted to purchase the rights to the French side for $40 million. This would give the U.S. a substantial head start on its own construction, provide the shortest possible route, and include the railroad. Seeing that the company would lose to Nicaragua, the Compagnie Nouvelle decided to sell for just $40 million, which would put the Panama project at a cost about equal to Nicaragua. Now, the biggest battle over the canal was to begin.
Congress was split between the two canal routes, Panama and Nicaragua. Roosevelt pushed through the acquisition of the French Panama Canal effort. Panama was then part of Colombia, so Roosevelt opened negotiations with the Colombians to obtain the necessary permission. In early 1903, the Hay-Herran Treaty was signed by both nations, but the Colombian Senate failed to ratify the treaty.
Panama was settled by the Spanish in the 16th century in 1821, under the leadership of the then colonel in command, José de Fábrega. It declared its independence from Spain. Panama then joined Simón Bolívar's Republic of Gran Colombia.
The Republic of Gran Colombia, 1819 to 1830, was a federation made up of Venezuela, New Granada, and Ecuador.
When the Republic of Gran Colombia dissolved in 1830, Panama became a province of New Granada, later to be renamed Colombia. This was an unstable relationship that lasted 73 years.
In 1903, Panama became independent of Colombia. This is a map of present-day Colombia.
U.S. treaty negotiations with Colombia stalled. So Roosevelt sidestepped Colombia by aiding Panama's independence movement.
In a controversial move, Roosevelt implied to Panamanian rebels that if they revolted, the U.S. Navy would assist their cause for independence. Roosevelt launched a naval blockade on both sides of Panama, and sent in U.S. troops to fend off the minimal Colombian forces.
Panama proceeded to proclaim its independence from Colombia in 1903, and the USS Nashville in local waters impeded any interference from Colombia. The U.S. gunboat Nashville prevented the Colombian military from sailing to Panama. An assault through the dense Panamanian jungle was impossible. Panama Canal timeline 1904 Americans begin digging. The United States formally took control of the French property relating to the canal on May 4, 1904.
The first chief engineer was John F. Wallace, an American civilian engineer. In 1904, work began on a new railroad track because the French track width was too narrow.
Wallace was replaced as chief engineer by John Frank Stevens, who arrived on the isthmus in 1905.
Stevens rapidly realized that a serious investment in infrastructure was necessary and set to upgrading the railway, improving sanitation in the cities of Panama and Colón, remodeling all of the old French buildings, and building hundreds of new ones to provide housing. Stevens then undertook the task of recruiting the huge labor force required for the building of the canal.
Like Wallace before him, Stevens found the red tape vexing, but his approach was to press ahead anyway, and get approval later. He improved the drilling and dirt removal equipment at the Culebra Cut, with a great improvement in efficiency. He also revised the inadequate provisions for the disposal of the vast quantities of spoil that were to be excavated.
Even at this date, no decision had been taken regarding whether the canal should be a lock canal or a sea-level canal. The excavation that was underway would be useful in either case.
In 1906, Roosevelt resolved in favor of a lock-type canal. The plan was similar in all essential respects to the one proposed by Lee Pinay years earlier, but rejected by de Lesseps.
Included in the proposal was an enormous earthen dam across the Chagres River at Gatun. The dam created what was then the largest artificial lake in the world, Gatun Lake, and at the same time it brought a considerable part of the Chagres River under control.
So massive was the lake that it was able to accommodate the greater part of the river, even at flood stage.
Perhaps more important, the man-made lake formed more than 20 miles of the canal route. Stevens resigned and was replaced by Major General George Washington Goethals. From this point on, the canal was under a military discipline control, and the Army was not going to relinquish this control. Roosevelt decided that Army engineers should carry out the work, and appointed Major General George Washington Goethals as chief engineer in 1907. One of the greatest challenges facing the builders of the Panama Canal was dealing with the tropical diseases in the area, particularly yellow fever and malaria.
Before any work could begin, the deadliest of the problems on the isthmus had to be overcome: disease. The government wasn't going to allow mortality rates like had been seen during the French reign. Somewhere between 10 and 20,000 were estimated to have died at the canal zone between 1882 and 1888. American Dr. William Gorgas was called to examine the area. The most troublesome diseases were the mosquito-carried malaria and yellow fever, the same diseases that had kept Napoleon Bonaparte from putting down the uprising in Haiti in 1801, but almost all diseases known to man were endemic: tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria, smallpox, and bubonic plague. The eventual success of the project is owed substantially to the sanitation program put in place by Dr. Gorgas, which included general health care and the provision of an extensive health infrastructure.
Gorgas was not the discoverer of the ability of mosquitoes to transmit certain diseases. That credit is reserved for Dr. Walter Reed and Sir Ronald Ross. Dr. Reed brought what he had learned in Havana to Panama. By the time the new dig began, Major Walter Reed a U.S. doctor conducting research in Cuba, had proven that mosquitoes carried yellow fever.
And C. Ronald Ross, a British bacteriologist who won the Nobel Prize in 1902 for his work showing that malaria was transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito.
The theory, and proven fact, was that malaria and yellow fever were transmitted from infected to healthy individuals by female mosquitoes of the Anopheles and Stegomyia breeds, which are only commonly found along the equator.
The goal of Gorgas was to eliminate the mosquito population from the canal zone. This was not easy as the French had built a veritable mosquito hotel along the canal site, including sewage drains and bowls of water used to protect people.
The efforts were a great success, and contributed significantly to the overall success of the canal project. The hospitals were reputed to be the best anywhere in the tropics. Some 32,000 patients were treated every year. By 1906, yellow fever was virtually wiped out in the canal zone, and the number of deaths caused by the other top disease, malaria, was also reduced significantly.
In 1905, new canal chief engineer John Stevens had agreed to simple precautionary measures, such as the use of netting and screens and the elimination of standing water.
A significant part of this work was an intensive effort to eradicate mosquitoes, the carriers of malaria and yellow fever, from the canal zone. This was accomplished by removing any possible sources of standing water in which mosquitoes breed, including draining and filling large areas of the swamp and oiling the remaining pools of standing water.
Gorgas troops busied themselves with covering all standing or slow-moving bodies of water with a combination of oil and insecticide, and isolating infected persons in wire screen tents.
It took the personal recommendation of John Stevens, then head engineer of the canal, to President Roosevelt for Gorgas to get the equipment and medicine he needed to accomplish what he started. But at last, the whole of the canal zone became the pest-free area that it remains today. Medical teams and hospitals could then pay more attention to other diseases, bubonic plague and tuberculosis, that affected the workers to a much lesser extent than malaria and yellow fever.
Malaria is carried by a much more common mosquito, and is still a scourge in many developing countries today. Great swaths of vegetation were removed around the canal. Malaria deaths among canal workers were eventually reduced from more than 200 in 1906 to less than 1 per year by the 1920s.
The last case of yellow fever in the canal area was reported in Panama City in late 1905. The advances in hygiene resulted in a relatively low death toll during the American construction. Still, 5,609 workers died during this period of 1904 to 1914. This brought the total death toll for the construction of the canal to 27,609.
One of the greatest barriers to a canal was the Continental Divide, which originally rose to 360 feet above sea level at its highest point.
The effort to create a cut through this barrier of rock was clearly one of the greatest challenges faced by the project, and indeed gave rise to one of the greatest engineering feats of its time.
The most difficult area of excavation was the area at Culebra Mountain, the Culebra Cut. The canal had to be dug out of the largest mountain in the path, which actually was one of the smallest mountains on the isthmus.
The French had floundered at Culebra because they had attempted to maintain a certain slope at the sides, an angle that became impossible to hold.
The heavy Panamanian rainfall caused mudslides year-round until a very gradual slope was attained by the massive steam shovels, working almost 24 hours a day.
This is a cross-section of the Culebra Cut. This is a 95-ton Bucyrus steam shovel in the Culebra Cut. In 1911, excavations were conducted simultaneously on several levels, requiring a sophisticated railroad network.
Railroads and heavy machinery were critical elements. Most notable was the use of more than 100 steam shovels, many of which were used to dig the Culebra Cut.
The Culebra Cut was later called Gaillard Cut, after David Dubois Gaillard, the American engineer who supervised its construction until his death in 1913.
Workers who labored in temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or higher used rock drills, dynamite, and steam shovels to remove as much as 96 million cubic yards of earth and rock as they lowered the floor of the excavation to within 40 feet of sea level.
On May 20, 1913, steam shovels made a passage through the Culebra Cut at the level of the canal bottom. The French effort had reduced the summit to 193 feet, but of a relatively narrow width. The Americans had lowered this to 40 feet above sea level, of a much greater width.
When the canal was first designed, the problem of landslides had been ignored. Slides of earth and, more importantly, rock increased the amount of excavation within Culebra. The cross-section of the canal was constantly being changed to accommodate for the landslides. The slides caused the upper edge of the cut to be taken back beyond its original lines.
The original design for the banks comprised a series of narrow benches which acted as rock catchers, alternating with short steep slopes. It was first decided by the International Board of Consulting Engineers that the rock would be stable at a slope of 1 in 1.5. It was also stated that the rock had the strength to stand at the height of 240 feet at 1 in 1.5. In fact, the rock began to collapse from that slope at the height of only 64 feet.
Numerous test borings had been carried out, and samples of the rock were taken. Therefore, the quality of the rock was known. The reason for the misjudgment of the strength was due to the underlying strata, which contained bands of clay and iron pyrites.
The iron pyrites seemed to cause the problems, as it is liable to oxidize when exposed to the air and moisture, with the result that the rock would disintegrate. Therefore, when the overlying material had been removed, rainwater precipitated through to the lower strata, which included the iron pyrites,
and rapid deterioration of the iron pyrite layer occurred.
The overlying layers then slid down.
2 artificial lakes form key parts of the canal: Lake Gatun and Lira Flores Lake. 4 dams were constructed to create these lakes.
By far the largest of the dams, and by far the most demanding, was the Gatun Dam across the Chagres River, which created and impounded Lake Gatun.
This huge earthen dam, which is 2,100 feet thick at the base and 7,500 feet long, was the largest of its kind in the world when the canal opened.
This is the wide expanse of Gatun Lake.
Along the route of the canal there is a series of 3 sets of locks: the Gatun, Pedro Miguel, and the Miraflores locks.
Here are the 3 sets of locks. The Gatun locks are on the Atlantic side, raising ships up to the level of Gatun Lake. The Pedro Miguel and Miraflores locks are on the Pacific side, lowering ships at the exit of the Gaillard Cut down to sea level.
Here is a profile, or cross-sectional view of the canal, showing the 3 sets of locks. A lock is a section of a waterway, enclosed by gates at either end to allow ships to be raised or lowered to a different water level. In this example, a ship enters the upper level, and the gates close behind it.
The water is then allowed to drain into the lower level, lowering the water level of the lock and the ship. When the water level of the lock equals the level of the lower canal, the lower gates will open and the ship can proceed.
This is an animation of the operation of a lock. The canal locks operate by gravity flow of water from Gatun, Alajuela, and Miraflores lakes, which are fed by the Chagres and other rivers.
Each set of locks is built in pairs to permit the simultaneous transit of vessels in either direction.
Water enters and leaves each lock through a system of main culverts or pipes, which connect to 100 holes in the floor of each chamber.
For each ship traveling through the canal, 52 million gallons of fresh water are used, fed by gravity flow from Gatun Lake. To conserve water, smaller ships often go through the locks together. The canal's 12 locks, 3 sets of double locks at each end, have the same dimensions: 110 feet wide by 1,000 feet long and 40 feet deep. The gates at each end are 7 feet thick.
The locks themselves were enormous, in keeping with the canal tradition, over 1,000 feet long each. They were manufactured in the U.S., transported to the site in sections, and cemented together. Water was to flow into or out of the locks through gigantic culverts in the walls of the locks, each being many times the height of a person.
The lock gates were also sent down in pieces and completed on site. And double sets of doors, 2 gates at each end of the lock, were installed for protection of the canal in case one gate was to be damaged or malfunctioned.
The lock gates are operated from a control tower, which is located on the wall that separates each pair of locks, and from which the flooding or emptying of the lock chambers is also controlled.
Another series of precautionary measures were later installed in the control house, all to keep anything from damaging the canal.
When the canal went into operation, it was built to survive a naval bombardment, runaway ships in the locks, malfunctioning equipment, and inept controllers. Railroad-type locomotives called mules held and moved the ships. Vessels did not traverse the locks under their own purvey.
Each lock gate has 2 leaves, 65 feet wide and 6.5 feet thick, set on hinges. The gates range in height from 46 to 82 feet. Their movement is powered by electric motors recessed in the lock walls.
Because of the delicate nature of the lock mechanisms, only small craft are allowed to pass through the locks under their own power. Larger crafts are taken through by electric towing locomotives, which operate on cog tracks on the lock walls.
This is an electric towing locomotive.
This is another electric towing locomotive.
This is an electric towing locomotive pulling the Holland America ship, Volendam, into the Gatun Lock.
This is an electric towing locomotive pulling the Holland America ship, Volendam, into the Gatun Lock.
The General Electric Company supplied construction equipment, locomotives, and all of the more than 1,000 electric motors used to run the locks. Roosevelt, once committed, supported the project enthusiastically, and so is almost universally thought of as the father of the canal. However, most of the actual work on the canal was done during the administration of William Howard Taft, 1909 to 1913, who had also been involved earlier in Roosevelt's administration as vice president.
At times more than 40,000 people were employed on the project. mostly laborers from the West Indian islands of Barbados, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, but also many engineers, administrators, and skilled tradesmen from the United States.
The canal, the greatest engineering feat yet attempted, was opened to traffic on August 15, 1914.
Panama Canal timeline 1914. The Panama Canal is completed.
Unfortunately, the opening came just as World War I started in Europe, and so the fact that the greatest human endeavor had been completed was last on almost everyone's mind. Celebrations were cancelled due to the onset of the war. Further landslides caused closures in 1915, and because of World War I, 1914 to 1918, the canal's formal opening was postponed until 1920. The final cost of the U.S. dig was about $375 million. Although a huge sum at that time, the project came in at about $23 million under budget.
It avoided the graft and corruption that frequently accompanied large construction projects. About 5,600 workers were killed during the project, roughly 8% of the workforce. The first ship to cross the isthmus was the concrete ship Cristóbal on January 7, 1914.
However, the first official and publicized ship to make the voyage was the Hankin on August 15, 1914, and the canal was officially opened to international traffic.
This is the Culebra Cut in 1914.
This is the USS Ohio as it passes through Cucaracha Slide in 1915.
This is the USS Texas in Gatun Lake in 1919. This is the USS Saratoga in the Mayflower's Locks in 1930. This is the Depeche Gamboa at the Gold Hill Slide in 1915.
The handover of the canal to Panama.
Panama Canal timeline. The Panama Canal is transferred to Panama at the end of 1999. Negotiations toward a new settlement began in 1974 and resulted in the Torrijos-Carter treaties. Signed by the President of the U.S. Jimmy Carter and Omar Torrijos Herrera of Panama in 1977, this started the process of handing the canal over to Panamanian control.
Though controversial within the U.S., the treaty led to full Panamanian control effective at noon on December 31, 1999, and control of the canal was handed over to the Panama Canal Authority.
The treaty terminated all prior treaties between the United States and Panama concerning the canal, and also abolished the canal zone. The treaty recognized Panama as a territorial sovereign in the former canal zone. Still, it gave the United States the right to continue managing, operating, and maintaining the canal, and to use lands and waters necessary for those purposes during a transition period of 20 years covered by the agreement.
The Panama Canal Authority is an autonomous agency of the Panamanian government, and took over the management of the canal from the joint U.S.-Panamanian Panama Canal Commission at noon on December 31, 1999. The canal can accommodate vessels from small private yachts to fairly large commercial ships. The maximum size of a vessel that previously could use the canal is known as Panamax. An increasing number of modern ships exceed this limit and are known as post-Panamax vessels.
The Panamax size is determined by the dimensions of the lock chambers, which are 1,000 feet long, 110 feet wide, and 40 feet deep. This is the Celebrity Mercury transiting the canal.
The maximum dimensions that were allowed for a ship transiting the canal were length, 965 feet, beam, or width, 106 feet, draft, 39.5 feet, and air draft, 190 feet. As measured from the waterline to the vessel's highest point, a Panamax cargo ship would typically have a displacement of around 65,000 tons.
With the expansion project now completed, the maximum dimensions allowed for a ship transiting the canal through the new locks are now: length, 1,200 feet, beam, or width, 161 feet, and draft, 50 feet.
The Panama Canal Expansion Project.
Panama Canal timeline. The expansion project started in 2007 and was completed in 2016. The Panama Canal Expansion Project, also called the Third Set of Locks Project, doubled the capacity of the Panama Canal by adding a new lane of traffic, allowing for a larger number of ships,
and increasing the width and depth of the lanes and locks, allowing larger ships to pass. The expanded canal began commercial operation on June 26, 2016. This is a map showing details of the expansion project.
The new larger size of ships, called New Panamax or Post-Panamax, is about 1.5 times the previous Panamax size and can carry over twice as much cargo.
This shows the increased size of the new locks to accommodate the larger ships. ATEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit used to describe the capacity of container ships and container terminals. It is basically a 20-foot long container. More often, you will see 40-foot long containers that are commonly pulled by a semi-trailer truck. These are equivalent to 2 TEUs.
One Post-Panamax ship can carry as many as 6,300 containers that are each 40 feet long. The new locks are wider, longer, and deeper, to allow for maximum container ship load increases from 4,800 TEU to 12,600 TEU.
The project constructed 2 new sets of locks, one each on the Atlantic and Pacific sides, and excavated new channels to the new locks. Existing channels were widened and deepened, and the maximum operating water level of Gatun Lake was increased.
Then Panamanian President Martin Torrijos formally proposed the project in 2006, saying it would transform Panama into a first-world country. The proposal to expand the canal was approved in a national referendum by approximately 77%. The project formally began in 2007.
The Panama Canal had 2 lanes each with its own set of locks. The expansion consists of adding a 3rd lane through the construction of lock complexes at each end of the canal.
A 2-mile-long access channel was excavated to connect the new Atlantic locks with the existing sea entrance of the canal. To connect the new Pacific side locks with the existing channels. 2 new access channels we built.
This is a diagram of the new locks complex with the water storage basins. The new locks will be in triple flights, with sliding lock gates in each chamber.
The level of Gatun Lake will be raised by approximately 1.5 feet to increase its usable water reserve capacity and the water system to provide 1,100 additional lockages per year.
This shows the location of the new locks complex on the Pacific side. The present locks, which are over 100 years old, will have greater access for maintenance and are projected to continue operating indefinitely.
Each flight of locks will be accompanied by 9 water reutilization basins, 3 per lock chamber. These gravity-fed basins will allow 60% of the water used in each transit to be reused. So the new locks will use 7% less water than the older locks. The deepening of Gatun Lake and the raising of its water level will also provide extra water storage capacity. These measures will allow the expanded canal to operate without the construction of new reservoirs.
This shows the dimensions of the old locks. This shows the new lock chambers, compared to the old ones.
The new lock chambers will use rolling gates instead of miter gates, which are used by the existing locks.
Rolling gates are used in almost all existing locks, with dimensions similar to those being proposed, and are well-proven technology.
The new locks will use tugboats to position the vessels instead of locomotives. As in the case of the rolling gates, tugs are successfully and widely utilized for these purposes in locks of similar dimensions. The Panama Canal was, is, and shall remain an engineering marvel of the 20th century. After more than 100 years of continual service, it continues to be as useful as the day it became operational.
What makes the Panama Canal remarkable is its self-sufficiency. The dam at Gatun is able to generate the electricity to run all the motors which operate the canal, as well as the locomotives in charge of towing the ships through the canal.
No force is required to adjust the water level between the locks except gravity. As the lock operates, the water simply flows into the locks from the lakes or flows out to the sea-level channels. The canal also relies on the overabundant rainfall of the area to compensate for the loss of the 52 million gallons of fresh water consumed during each crossing. While under U.S. administration, tolls for use of the canal were set at rates calculated to cover costs of maintenance and operation, thereby making the canal self-financing. The charge for each transit was based upon the interior cargo or passenger carrying capacity of a vessel.
The rates established in 1914 remained virtually unchanged for 60 years. In 1973, the canal operated at a loss for the first time, and in 1974, the first of several rate increases went into effect.
The toll was initially 90 cents a ton, but was raised in 1974 due to increasing costs of operation. Because the canal is only allowed to break even, the toll became $1.08 a ton.
How many berths do you have? 2,000 passenger and 1,000 crew, so 3,000 total. That'll be $120 times 3,000. Equals $360,000.
Do you take Visa or MasterCard?
Both, but with cash you get a discount. It'll be only $300,000.
With the opening of the new locks as part of the canal expansion, this record has been exceeded, since much larger ships can now pass through the canal. As of July 6, 2016, the new record is held by the MOL Benefacto, a 10,000 TEU cargo ship, which paid $829,000 to transit the new locks.
It is expected that when a post-Panamax ship with up to 13,000 TEU of cargo transits the new canal, the record toll will pass $1 million.
The cheapest toll ever paid to travel the canal was 36 cents in 1928 by Richard Halliburton, who swam the length of the canal.
The climate of Panama. Will it be hot? Oh, will it be very hot in Panama? Here are the average high and low temperatures in degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year in Colón.
Here are the average high and low temperatures in degrees Celsius throughout the year in Colón.
Here is the average monthly rainfall in inches in Colón. Although the temperatures do not have much of a seasonal variation, we see that there is a limited drier season from January through April.
In Panama and in the rest of the region, there are only two seasons. The wet season called winter and the dry, or less wet, season called summer.
Cristóbal is the port area of Colón on Limon Bay at the Atlantic entrance of the Panama Canal.
Cristóbal Colón is the Spanish translation for Christopher Columbus. Colón is the second largest city in Panama, with a city population of 80,000, and a metropolitan area population, including Cristóbal, of 220,000.
Colón was founded by the United States in 1850 as the Atlantic terminal of the Panama Railroad. The railroad was then under construction to meet the demand during the California Gold Rush for a fast route to California.
Panama Canal timeline: 1515 El Camino Real, 1848 California Gold Rush, 1850 to 1855 Panama Railway built, 1880 French work begins, 1888 French effort ends, 1903 Independence of Panama from Colombia, 1904 Americans begin digging, 1914 Canal completed.
Recommended videos: Panama Canal.
Recommended video: Modern Marvels, The Construction of the Panama Canal, 44 minutes, 45 seconds.
Recommended video: How Panama Canal Works Animation, 2 minutes, 31 seconds.
Recommended video: World's Most Important Waterway, the Panama Canal, 6 minutes.
Recommended video: The Panama Canal, the greatest engineering feat in history, 22 minutes, 58 seconds.
Recommended video: The World's Shortcut, How the Panama Canal Works, 11 minutes, 22 seconds.
Table of Contents: The Panama Canal.
Thanks for watching. Please watch some more of my great videos.